friends. Welcome to Foggy Oak Fairy Tales, a stories podcast for all ages, where we tell farm stories from real life happenings on Foggy Oak Farm, as well as fantasy tales to spark both learning and imagination. I'm so glad you're here. It seems this spring is one for stories of celestial events. Because just last weekend, we were treated to the exceptionally rare experience of being able to see the Aurora Borealis, or Northern Lights, here in Southwest Virginia. Join me this week to learn about the Northern Lights and the unusual experience of seeing them in the southern sky. Big thanks to space.com for their outstanding articles and research on all of the topics covered in this episode. If you're like me, you might have dreamed of seeing the Aurora Borealis, also known as the Northern Lights. And if you're like me, you don't live anywhere remotely close to a place that would allow you to see them. Many of my friends feel the same way. We'd love to have the chance to go somewhere very far north to see them someday, but it's hard to figure out exactly when that could happen. But sometimes you get very, very lucky, and the Northern Lights come to you. And that, friends, is precisely what happened for Foggy Oak Farm just over a week ago. I didn't know much about the Northern Lights before last week. I had pretty much thought of them as nature's version of fireworks. Colorful ribbons and blasts of light that undulated and danced across the skies of far northern climes. That wasn't wrong, but it turns out there is so much more. Maybe, like me, you saw the news over the past couple of weeks saying that there have been big solar storms happening and that you might be able to see the Northern Lights in unusual places as a result. Maybe you wondered, why would storms on the sun affect the Aurora Borealis? I certainly did, because I didn't know what causes the Northern Lights. Let's dive into that. They are created when energized particles from the sun, also known as solar wind, are blasted off of the sun and towards Earth, hurtling at us at up to 45 million miles per hour. But rather than causing a dangerous problem, we are protected thanks to Earth's magnetic field. This barrier, created from deep within our planet and radiating outwards into space, creates a region around us known as the magnetosphere. And this sphere protects us from that powerful solar wind, redirecting the charged particles towards the Earth's poles and, in the process, producing the magnificent atmospheric event known as the Northern Lights. If you were just thinking, hey, the Earth has two poles, does that mean there are southern lights? You would be exactly right. There are southern lights too, also called Aurora Australis. We'll maybe talk about those another time, but today we're focused on the Northern Lights. Okay, so what is creating those colors then? Well, the colors that appear in the lights are determined by the chemicals in Earth's atmosphere. You might have seen that in pictures of the Northern Lights, they tend to be dominated by reds and greens. The red is coming from nitrogen molecules and the green from oxygen. So those are very dominant in the atmosphere, and those are the colors they produce when they interact. Since the wind coming from the sun is variable and the way it hits the atmosphere and is radiated towards the poles happens at different rates and interacts with the atmosphere in different ways, you get different types of movement and shapes in the lights that we see. The Northern Lights can normally be seen within the auroral zone, which functionally means spots within a 1,500 or so mile radius of the North Pole. Because remember, the poles are a big part of how that solar wind is redirected and diffused. So it makes sense that when there's a bigger than usual storm on the sun, there would be more solar wind generated to come towards Earth, and that the auroral radius would expand, making it possible for more places to have a view of the Northern Lights. I also didn't realize that the sun's emissions have their own cycle, and we're headed into what's known as a solar maximum in 2024 and 2025, where there will be more solar storms and thus more opportunities to see the lights and see them more distinctly than during a quieter period in the sun's 11-year cycle. Lucky us. Whether this particular storm was part of the solar maximum or not, we heard Friday night that we ought to plan to head outside around midnight to try and witness the lights, if the weather cooperated. It was already an exciting weekend on the farm. My husband's parents were visiting, the kids had a long weekend, and they were over the moon at having several days of uninterrupted grandparent time. So I admit we hadn't done the best job of getting everyone to bed. The plan was for all of us to go to bed at a decent hour and then wake up and try to go out and see the lights. The reality of how the evening went was we put a movie on a little too late and we're just starting to wind things down around 10:30 when my husband David informed us that the meteorological corners of social media that he frequents were saying that we needed to get outside right now. The peak visibility had shifted and the lights were supposedly here. "Let's hurry and go check," my daughter Kathy said. We sprang into action, hustling out of the house and into the night. "I don't have shoes on," my daughter Rory proclaimed merrily. "Rory, go put shoes on," I scolded. "I don't either," my daughter Kathy chimed in. "I think you guys will regret that, but I guess it's your choice," David told them. "Maybe a jacket at least?" I asked. It was chilly out there. Kathy made an exasperated gesture to her shoulders. She was already wrapped in a blanket she'd brought from inside. "I don't need one," Rory said with a laugh as she skipped gingerly across the gravel driveway in her bare feet and summer nightgown. We could tell that with our various solar and garage lights, it was going to be too bright beside the house to see much of anything, so we continued towards the sheep and goat pasture, which is usually much darker. When we got out to the pasture, we could see the sky, but it wasn't evident to us whether we were seeing any auroral things. "Maybe it looks a little reddish?" Kathy asked. "Probably just lights from the city," David disagreed. "I think they are supposed to be more visible from the north. That way," he said, pointing towards my parents' house, which is situated at the top of a big hill on the other side of our pasture. "Let's go see," Rory cried, racing forward to a steady refrain of "ow, ow, ow," as she stepped on rocks in her bare feet. But go and see we did, slipping through the gate between our property and theirs, past a tall strand of pines that blocked our view of the northern sky from the pasture. "I see them! I see them!" Kathy exclaimed, gesturing at the sky. Sure enough, we could make out a stronger bloom of red seeping across the sky and pale shafts of wavering white light that looked like the ghosts of moonbeams. "Is that green over there?" I asked, pointing further to the left. "I think so. Let's go see," David said with enthusiasm. Our group dashed across my parents' front lawn and clomped over their deck to get to the side yard where the green bands would, we hoped, be more visible. I ran into my parents' house to make them aware of what was going on, and I admit that I quite unceremoniously woke them up with a "Mom, Dad, get out here! You can see them now!" My dad could not be budged. He was exhausted from working outside on landscaping and getting set up for baby chicks all day. But my mother agreed to join us outside for the light show. When I made it back outside, everyone was standing at the top of the hill, heads tilted towards the sky, with the wonder of seeing the lights here plain in their expressions. Above us, pale green lights shone, while to the right, more bands of dancing white ribbons flamed. The red bloom was still visible, and growing larger behind us. We moved down the hill a bit to get an even better look, since some of the other pine trees were blocking things a bit, and I heard an "ow, ow, wow, wow" from behind me. Rory had stepped right into the middle of a prickly weed, and was leaping out of it and downhill with reckless abandon. No, let's not do that, Rory," I said, scooping her up and carrying her with me down the hill. Kathy also hit a prickly weed in her own bare feet and promptly sat down on her blanket to try and protect herself from any further prickly problems. For a time, we just stood there, marveling at something none of us had ever seen. Then, David's father thought to try and take a picture. Like many phones these days, his has an automatic night mode that allows for a longer exposure when taking pictures at night. This means that the camera takes pictures over a longer time period and does a better job at capturing details and colors. What we saw with our eyes was impressive enough, but we were blown away by what he showed us when he turned his phone around to display the photograph. We saw hints of greens and whites and reds with our eyes, but the camera divulged a veritable firestorm. Ribbons of lava-like red, rays of purple, neon green highlights, flashes of that ghostly white. It captured what our eyes, which are not well adapted to perceiving colors at night, could only grasp the faintest hint of. So for a good long while, we also compared what we could see when we took a staggeringly large series of pictures to what we could see with our eyes. "Look," we exclaimed to one another, "look over there. See if the camera can see that flash better." And it could, and it did. And we got to experience the Aurora Borealis in an entirely different way than we had expected. It's worth noting that when you see pictures of the Aurora Borealis, it probably doesn't look that clear when you're standing there watching it. This is exactly why. Our eyes just can't pick up all of the colors in the way that the camera can. After probably 45 minutes of this, the light seemed to be moving away, back towards our house. With a thank you to my mom, we shuffled our way back towards Foggy Oak Farm, with me staggering up the hill trying to carry my shoeless youngest, and others holding a flashlight out in front of Kathy so that she didn't have to repeat the experience of stepping in prickers. We paused in the pasture on the way back. Kathy wrapped Rory in her blanket as well so they could watch together, and we enjoyed the lights there for a time. Not, I grant, for very long, because I have set up a chain of motion-activated solar lights that go off when you move. The idea is to make it easier to walk through the pasture at night, but in this case, we kept yelling at each other to stop moving, just as a solar light would flash on because one of us had to scratch an itchy nose. But we had seen the magnificence of the lights at my parents' house, so this wasn't a particularly big problem. In spite of the blanket, Rory was beginning to get cold anyway. So we finished our trek back to the house and, now with shoes, went out back to the backyard to see if our farm's namesake, the huge old oak tree that marks the boundary with our neighbor's property, was getting any of the light show. It was. Not as much as we'd seen at my parents', but enough to get at least a couple of lovely pictures of the oak lit by the glory of the northern lights. As we watched, Rory, who I was holding again, whispered in my ear, "I don't want to go to bed, but I'm so tired." "Well, it's definitely past your bedtime," I agreed. "Let's go get some sleep, and maybe we can watch the lights from your room." "I'm just not used to staying up so late," Rory explained as we went inside. "But it was amazing." "This was very special," her grandmother agreed, taking her in for a goodnight hug. "I'm so glad we got to see it with you." And then Rory and I went upstairs and got ready for bed, watching the sky out the window for a while before our eyes became too heavy, still full of awe at what we had been privileged to witness as we drifted off to sleep. The end. Remember, you're part of the story too. What did you think of this story? What did you imagine when you were listening? We'd love to hear your part of the story. If you and your grown-up want, you can share your thoughts or a picture you drew with our Foggy Oak podcast family. You might find it easiest to share with us on Facebook at Foggy Oak Farm, but we have lots of options on our website, foggyoakfairytales.com. You can also check out pictures from the farm and learn more about us. Thanks for being part of the story, and I hope you'll join us next week.